Picture this. A wooden door shatters. It is the winter of 1450 in a remote Balkan village, and the screams outside aren't from a massacre, they are from a selection. You watch an Ottoman officer drag a screaming 8-year-old boy from his mother's grip. He doesn't strike the child. Instead, he forces the boy's jaw open, checking his teeth like he's buying a horse. He strips the boy naked in the freezing snow to inspect his body for scars or moles. This official is looking for perfection. If the boy is too short, he is rejected. If he is an orphan, he is rejected for being too street smart. But this boy passes. The scribe dips his pen and writes a new destiny on a scroll. In seconds, a Christian peasant is dead and a recruit for the Ottoman Janissaries is born. This was the blood tax, a system where the smartest and strongest children were harvested like crops to serve a sultan they had never seen. While Europe relied on knights born into nobility, the Ottoman Empire built a superpower by enslaving the children of its subjects. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The mechanics of this human harvest were brutal and precise. The crane keeper, or Tunatsi Bashi, marched into Christian towns with a regiment of soldiers and a stack of empty registers. He demanded all boys between 8 and 20 to gather in the square. The villagers knew the drill. Mothers smeared mud on their sons' faces to make them look sick. Fathers bribed the local priest to change baptismal records. But the Ottoman clerks were experts at spotting deception. They examined the boys' hands for calluses and their eyes for intelligence. They weren't just looking for soldiers, they were shopping for the future administrators of the empire. Once selected, the separation was immediate. The boys were dressed in red tunics and shackled together in long columns. They began the march to Istanbul, leaving behind wailing families who performed funeral rites for the living. To the village, their son was dead. He would never return to this mud brick house. He would never speak his mother tongue again. The Devshirme system was a masterstroke of cold pragmatism. The Sultan feared the Turkish nobility, men with land, money, and rival ambitions. He needed a weapon that had no loyalty to anyone but him. By taking these boys from Christian lands, stripping them of their identity and converting them to Islam, the state created a class of men who were technically slaves, but held the keys to the empire. They had no family to favour, no lands to protect, and no reason to live other than to serve the throne. The road to the capital was the first test of their endurance. Weakness was purged on the march. Those who fell behind were left behind. Those who survived arrived at the gates of the capital not as boys, but as raw material. The most handsome and intellectually gifted were siphoned off to the palace school to become viziers and pashas. The rest, the strong, the enduring, the fighters, were sent to the Turkish farms of Anatolia. Here, the real breaking began. They worked the fields under the harsh sun, forced to speak only Turkish. A single word of Serbian, Greek or Bulgarian earned them a beating. They learned the prayers of Islam 5 times a day until the rhythm of the Quran replaced the memories of village hymns. This was the death of the self. The Ottomans knew that to build the perfect soldier, you first had to destroy the individual. This transformation turned victims into the Sultan's elite guards. But this absolute power came with a hidden cost. When you take a child and turn him into a weapon, you create a force that knows only strength. And as the centuries passed, the sultans would learn a terrifying lesson. A weapon does not love its master. It only obeys the hand that feeds it, and if that hand stops feeding, the weapon turns. The gates of the Asimi barracks slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a coffin lid. For the boys who survived the march from the Balkans, the city of Istanbul was a glittering, terrifying labyrinth. They were no longer sons. They were raw iron waiting for the furnace. The Ottoman military machine did not want soldiers who thought for themselves. It wanted a collective of killers whose only reflex was obedience. This required a systematic demolition of the human spirit, a process the Ottomans had perfected into a dark science. Training began before the sun touched the minarets of the Hagia Sophia. The recruits were stripped of their red tunics and given the coarse, heavy wool of the novice. Their first task was labour, not for the glory of war, but for the crushing weight of humility. They carried stones for the Sultan's endless construction projects, chopped wood in the freezing forests of the Black Sea, and worked the galleys until their palms were a map of raw blisters and thick calluses. This was the seasoning. The commanders watched closely, looking for the slightest flicker of rebellion or the faintest shadow of homesickness. Any boy caught weeping for his mother or whispering in his native tongue was met with the faleka, a brutal punishment where the soles of the feet were beaten with a wooden rod until they were a pulp of bruised flesh. Pain was the primary instructor. The Janissary-to-be learned that his body was not his own, it belonged to the state. But the Ottomans were smarter than simple torturers. They knew that pain alone creates a victim, not a devotee. To turn a slave into a fanatic, they needed to replace his lost family with a new unbreakable brotherhood. This is where the peculiar culture of the Janissary barracks took hold. They were organised into ortas, or regiments, but these weren't just military units, they were households. Every aspect of their lives revolved around the kitchen. While European armies looked to flags and heraldry, the Janissaries looked to the soup cauldron, the Khazan-e-Sharif. The officers held titles like head scullion and soup maker. This wasn't a joke, it was a profound psychological anchor. In a world where these boys had been stolen and starved, the man who fed them became their father. The Sultan was the ultimate provider, the great provider who filled their bowls. To overturn the cauldron was the highest form of treason, a physical manifestation of a broken bond. They lived as celibate monks, forbidden from marrying, forbidden from growing beards, and forbidden from engaging in any trade. They were a separate caste, a holy order of the blade. This spiritual dimension was cemented by the Bektashi order of dervishes. The Janissaries weren't just soldiers of the state, they were the sons of Haji Bektash Veli. This mystic Sufi influence gave them a sense of divine purpose that set them apart from the regular Turkish cavalry. They wore a distinctive tall white felt cap called a kürk, with a long flap of fabric hanging down the back. This flap symbolised the sleeve of their patron saint, Haji Bektash, resting eternally on their shoulders to bless their path. This wasn't just a uniform, it was a shroud. A Janissary was taught from his first day in the barracks that he was already dead to the world. He was a ghost walking the earth, existing only to strike when the Sultan pointed. By the end of their 7-year apprenticeship, the transformation was complete. The shepherd boy who once feared the dark now stood as a silent, disciplined veteran of the palace guard. He had mastered the composite bow, the yataghan sword, and the early temperamental firearms that most of Europe still viewed with suspicion. He spoke fluent Turkish, prayed toward Mecca, and looked upon his former homeland as a foreign territory to be conquered. The Sultan had successfully reached into the heart of Christendom, plucked out its best fruit, and turned it into a poison aimed at the very hands that grew it. This was the secret of the Janissaries' early success. They were the world's first professional standing army since the Roman legions. While the kings of France and England were still scrambling to call up feudal levies of peasants who wanted nothing more than to go home to their harvests, the Sultan had 10,000 men who had no home to return to. They didn't fight for land because they couldn't own it. They didn't fight for their children because they weren't allowed to have them. They fought because the barracks was their universe and the man on the throne was their god. However, this absolute isolation created a dangerous vacuum. Because they were severed from the rest of society, the Janissaries developed an intense insular pride. They began to realise that they were the only thing standing between the Sultan and his enemies. They were the muscle of the empire, the iron fist that held the House of Osman together. And in the quiet of the barracks, as the novices stirred the great cauldrons of soup, a new thought began to circulate among the veterans. If we are the ones who keep the Sultan on his throne, why should we ever take orders from a man who has never bled on the battlefield? The death of the self had created the perfect soldier, but it had also birthed a collective ego that would eventually demand the entire empire as its prize. Steam rises from the massive brass pots, while carrying the scent of mutton and spice through the stone corridors of the barracks. For any other army, this is just lunch. For the Ottoman Janissaries, this is a religious ceremony. At the centre of their courtyard sits the Kazan-i-Sharif, the sacred cauldron. This piece of cookware is the most important object in the empire outside of the Sultan's throne. To the Janissaries, the cauldron represents the bread and salt bond between the master who feeds and the slave who dies. The Janissaries organised their entire military hierarchy around the kitchen. Your colonel isn't called a colonel, he is the sorbachi, the soup maker. The officers below him are head cooks and water carriers. On their tall white felt caps, where a modern soldier might pin a medal, the Janissary wears a wooden spoon. This isn't a quirk of history. It is a warning. It signals to the world that these men are fed by the Sultan's hand, and they will devour anyone who threatens his kitchen. This culinary obsession created a terrifyingly tight bond. When the Janissaries were happy, they ate together in a rhythmic, disciplined silence that unnerved foreign ambassadors. But when they were angry, they didn't march or shout. They simply refused to eat. They would march into the centre of Istanbul and overturn their massive cauldrons in the dirt. The sound of a heavy brass pot hitting the cobblestones was the most feared sound in the Ottoman capital. It was the overturned cauldron, a formal declaration of mutiny that often ended with the severed head of a Grand Vizier or even a Sultan on a silver platter. While their daily life was governed by the kitchen, their souls belonged to the dervishes. The Janissaries were the armed wing of the Bektashi order, a secretive and mystical branch of Sufi Islam. Unlike the grim, orthodox clerics of the capital, the Bektashi dervishes preached a faith of hidden meanings and absolute loyalty to the brotherhood. A Bektashi dervish always lived within the barracks, marching into battle alongside the men, chanting poems and playing the kopuz, a long-necked lute. They provided the spiritual armour that made the Janissaries believe they were invincible. This combination of kitchen bond and mystic faith turned the Janissaries into the first true professional infantry of the early modern world. In the 1400s, the rest of the world's armies were a mess of feudal lords and reluctant peasants. A French knight fought for his own glory. A German mercenary fought for gold. But the Janissary fought for the Orta, his regiment. He lived in the barracks year-round. He practiced his archery and swordplay every single day. While the knights of Europe were busy managing their estates or hunting deer, the Janissaries were becoming the most efficient killing machines on the planet. They were the Sultan's living wall. In battle, they didn't charge blindly. They stood in the centre of the Ottoman line, surrounding the Sultan's tent, often protected by a ditch or a palisade of sharpened stakes. They waited. They let the irregular troops and the cavalry take the first shock of the enemy. Only when the enemy was exhausted and bloody did the Janissaries move. They advanced in a slow, silent phalanx, the only sound being the rhythmic thud of their boots and the haunting, high-pitched scream of the zurna, the Ottoman war oboe. This was the secret rise in action. By the time the world realised what the Sultans had built, it was too late. The Janissaries had become a state within a state. They were the only ones allowed to carry weapons in the city. They were the only ones who received a guaranteed salary in gold. They were the elite 1%, recruited from the bottom of society to sit at the very top. But this exclusivity bred a dangerous pride. They began to believe that the Ottoman Empire didn't belong to the House of Osman. It belonged to the men who held the spoons. The year is 1526, and the sun is setting over the marshy plains of Mohacs. On one side stands the flower of European chivalry, thousands of Hungarian knights encased in the finest steel armour money can buy, their lances gleaming like a forest of silver. They represent the old world, the world of individual glory and noble blood. On the other side, silent and unmoving, stands a wall of men in white felt caps. They carry no lances. They do not seek individual glory. Instead, they hold long, heavy wooden stocks tipped with iron pipes. To the knights, these are cowardly toys, loud and smoky distractions. To the Ottoman Janissaries, these are the tools of a new god. When the Hungarian charge begins, the ground trembles. The knights spur their horses, confident that their armour will deflect any arrow. But as they close the distance, the Janissaries do something revolutionary for the 16th century. They wait. They don't fire in a disorganised scramble. They stand in disciplined ranks, 3 deep, The first rank kneels, the command is given, and a deafening crack shatters the air. A wall of lead slugs travelling faster than any arrow punches through the invincible steel of the knights. Men are blown backward off their saddles, horses scream and collapse. Before the smoke even clears, the first rank of Janissaries is already reloading, while the second rank steps forward to deliver another volley. This was the birth of modern warfare. While European monarchs were still debating whether gunpowder was unchivalrous, the Sultan's elite guards had already embraced it as their primary identity. They were the first infantry force in history to be fully equipped with firearms as a standard issue weapon. They called these early muskets tufek, and they treated them with the same religious devotion they gave to their soup cauldrons. The adoption of the arquebus changed the DNA of the Janissary. No longer did they need the decades of training required to master the composite bow. Now the state could take a recruit and within months turn him into a component of a mass-killing machine. This shifted the balance of power on the planet. The age of the knight was over. The age of the professional gunpowder-drilled soldier had begun. The secret to their success wasn't just the weapon itself, but the logistics behind it. The Ottoman Empire created the world's first industrial military complex to support the Janissaries. Behind every regiment of shooters was a dedicated unit of sebesi, armourers and technicians who maintained the weapons, manufactured the gunpowder, and ensured a steady supply of lead bullets. While a European army might run out of powder after 3 days of fighting, the Janissaries had a supply chain that stretched all the way back to the mines of Anatolia. On the battlefield, this created a psychological terror that is hard to overstate. Imagine being a soldier in the 1500s. You're used to the sounds of clashing steel and the shouting of men. Suddenly, you're faced with a disciplined, silent force that produces thunder and lightning at will. The smoke from their volleys created a literal fog of war, hiding the Janissaries from view until the next flash of fire revealed they were even closer than before. They moved like a ghost in the machine, a wall of fire that didn't break, didn't panic and didn't stop until the field was covered in the broken remnants of the old world. By the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Janissaries were no longer just a guard unit. They were a geopolitical sledgehammer. They were the ones who breached the walls of Rhodes, who stared down the Habsburgs at the gates of Vienna, and who pushed the borders of Islam deep into the heart of Europe. They were the masters of the thundersticks, and for 100 years there wasn't a force on earth that could look them in the eye and survive. But as the smoke of Mohatch cleared, and the Janissaries looked at the piles of noble dead, a dangerous realization took hold. If their cowardly toys could unseat a king and destroy an army of knights in a single afternoon, then who was truly the most powerful man in the empire? Was it the Sultan, who sat in his harem surrounded by silk and poetry? Or was it the man with the soot-stained hands, standing over a smoking barrel of iron? The transition from slave soldier to political kingmaker was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The very technology that gave the Sultan the world would eventually be used to take his throne. The dawn of May 29th, 1453 did not bring light to the city of Constantinople. It brought the end of the world. For 53 days, the massive Theodosian walls, the greatest fortifications in Christendom, had withstood the pounding of Ottoman cannons. The fields outside the city were littered with the bodies of irregular soldiers and Anatolian levies who had thrown themselves at the walls in vain. Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, stood in his tent, looking at the city that had defied his ancestors for centuries. He knew his reputation was on the line. He had one card left to play. He turned to his commanders and gave the order to unleash the Ottoman Janissaries. Suddenly, the chaotic noise of the siege fell into a terrifying silence. The irregular troops retreated, clearing a path. Through the dust and the smoke, a solid block of white felt caps began to move. There was no shouting, no disorganized running. The Janissaries advanced to the sound of the meta, the world's first military marching band. The deep rhythmic thrum of the giant kettle drums matched the heartbeat of the soldiers. They moved as a single shadow, a living machine of iron and silk. Each man knew his place. Each man knew his death was a requirement for the Sultan's glory. As they reached the base of the battered walls, the Janissaries didn't scramble for ladders like the men before them. They moved with a cold, surgical precision. They targeted the gaps in the stone, using their specialised axes and short swords to carve a path through the defenders. The Byzantine soldiers, exhausted and starving after months of siege, looked down from the battlements and saw something they had never faced before. Men who did not flinch when an arrow struck the comrade beside them. These were the stolen children come back as the harbingers of doom. The breakthrough happened near the gate of St. Romanus. A small breach had been opened by the cannons, and the Janissaries poured into it like a flood of molten lead. Hassan of Ulubat, a giant of a Janissary, was the first to scale the crumbling masonry. He held the Ottoman flag in one hand and his scimitar in the other. He was struck by 18 arrows, but he refused to fall until the crescent moon was planted firmly on the Roman stone. His death was the signal. The psychological dam broke. The cry went up through the streets of the Queen of Cities, "The city is taken." By noon, the Roman Empire was a ghost. Mehmed II rode his horse through the gates, but he didn't enter alone. He was surrounded by his Janissary guard, their white caps stained with the dust of the fallen empire. This victory changed the course of human history. The Middle Ages ended in that breach, and the modern era began. But for the Ottoman Janissaries, the fall of Constantinople was more than a military victory. It was a promotion. They were no longer just the Sultan's guard. They were the owners of the capital. The Sultan moved his court to the heart of the city. And the Janissaries took over the most strategic barracks in the new Istanbul. They became the heartbeat of the empire. Every palace intrigue, every trade deal, and every royal succession now had to pass through the filter of the barracks. They had broken the walls of the world, but in doing so, they had also broken the leash that held them. The boys who were once gathered as a tax had now collected the greatest prize in history, and they had no intention of ever giving it back. The gold coin feels heavy in the palm of a Janissary's hand. It is minted with the name of a new sultan, fresh from the treasury, and it carries a silent, deadly message. In the early days of the empire, the sultan was the master who provided bread. By the mid-16th century, the roles had reversed. Now, the sultan was a hostage to his own guards. This was the era of the Kulas Bakshishi, the accession bounty. Every time a new ruler climbed the stairs to the throne in Topkapi Palace, he had to pay a massive bribe to the Janissary corps. If the payment was too small, or if it arrived too late, the palace would not hear cheers. It would hear the rhythmic banging of spoons against brass cauldrons. The Janissaries had moved from the fringes of the empire to the very heart of the capital. They were no longer just a fighting force, they were the city's police, its firemen, and its most powerful labour union. They held the keys to the city's gates and the docks of the Golden Horn. In theory, they were still the Sultan's slaves, but in practice they had become a hereditary aristocracy. The old rules of the Devshirme, the blood tax that only took Christian boys, began to crumble under the weight of greed. Turkish families, seeing the immense wealth and tax exemptions the Janissaries enjoyed, began to clamour for their own sons to be admitted. They saw the white felt cap not as a mark of slavery, but as a golden ticket to the ruling class. Slowly, the rigorous selection process was replaced by bribery and nepotism. The elite unblemished warriors were being replaced by the sons of shopkeepers and local thugs who had never seen a day of actual military seasoning in Anatolia. These new recruits didn't want to spend years in a freezing barracks learning the art of the musket. They wanted the salary, the prestige, and the power to intimidate the local population. This shift transformed the Janissaries into a vampire state. They began to engage in trade, opening coffee houses and butcher shops, using their military status to crush any competition. If a merchant refused to pay protection money, his shop might mysteriously burn down, and since the Janissaries were also the city's firemen, they would only arrive to extinguish the flames once the owner had agreed to their terms. The shadow of God on earth, the Sultan, found himself presiding over a capital where his own guards were the primary source of lawlessness. The discipline that had broken the walls of Constantinople was rotting from within. The Janissaries began to refuse to go on campaign if the weather was too cold or the distance too far. They demanded higher pay while providing less service. Or the golden leash that the Sultan had used to control the empire had been handed to the dogs, and they were the ones doing the leading. The barracks, once a place of monastic devotion, had become a den of political conspirators who spent their days discussing which vizier to execute and which sultan to humiliate. By the time of Suleiman the Magnificent's death, the Janissaries had realised the ultimate secret of power. The sultan was only a sultan because they allowed him to be. They had become a permanent armed lobby that could veto any policy of the state. The empire was still expanding, but the engine driving it was no longer fuelled by loyalty. It was fuelled by a never-ending demand for gold. The stolen children had grown up, and they had decided that the father who stole them owed them everything. If you walked past the Janissary barracks in 1450, you would have heard only the sounds of prayer and weapon drills. It was a monastery of war. But by 1600, if you walked past those same walls, you would hear something that would have made the early sultans roll in their graves. The crying of babies. The unravelling of the Ottoman Janissaries didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in the bedroom. For 2 centuries, the absolute strength of the core relied on celibacy. A man with no wife and no children has no fear of death, because his legacy ends with him. He is disposable. But in 1566, Sultan Selim II, known to history as Selim the Drunkard, made a fatal concession. Bowing to immense pressure from his own guards, he lifted the ban on marriage. The floodgates opened. The fierce, solitary wolves of the empire suddenly became fathers, and a soldier with a family is a fundamentally different creature than a soldier with only a cause. He begins to worry about who will feed his children if he dies. He begins to calculate the risks of charging into a hail of enemy fire. The Brotherhood of the Spoon was replaced by the Brotherhood of the Diaper. With families came the need for money, more money than the Sultan's treasury could provide. The Janissaries moved out of the barracks and into the city. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They became the mafia of Istanbul. They opened coffee shops, butcheries and bakeries, but they didn't compete fairly. A Janissary baker didn't need to worry about the price of wheat or market regulations. If a competitor undercut his prices, Ziosti, that competitor would receive a visit from a dozen armed men in white caps. They exempted themselves from taxes and used their military status to bully the local guilds. The elite guard had transformed into a racketeering syndicate. But the deepest cut was yet to come. Once the Janissaries had sons, they wanted those sons to inherit their power. The ancient, brutal meritocracy of the Devshirme system, where only the strongest Christian boys were selected, was quietly dismantled. The Janissaries demanded that their own children, born Muslims and raised in the comfort of the capital, be allowed to enter the corps. These were the Kul Olu, the sons of the slave. This was the death knell of the empire's military supremacy. The ranks were no longer filled with the hardened survivors of the Balkan mountains who had been broken and rebuilt by the state. They were filled with soft, city-born boys who inherited their position like a family heirloom. The title of Janissary became a commodity. It was a membership card to a privileged club that offered a steady salary and legal immunity, with almost no expectation of actually fighting. The recruitment officers stopped going to the Balkans. Why bother trekking through the snow to find new talent when the barracks were already overflowing with the nephews and cousins of the commanders? The blood tax faded away, not because the Ottomans grew a conscience, but because the Janissaries grew greedy. They closed the door behind them, ensuring that the wealth of the empire stayed within their own genetic pool. By the mid-17th century, the Ottoman army looked impressive on paper. The payroll list showed hundreds of thousands of Janissaries, but in reality it was a ghost army. Officers would keep dead soldiers on the books to pocket their salaries. They sold enlistment papers to random civilians, grocers, tailors, even children, who wanted the tax breaks attached to the title. When the Sultan called for war, he would look out at his muster grounds and find a mob of untrained shopkeepers holding rusty muskets, men who were more afraid of losing their inventory than losing the battle. The Sultan's elite guards had become the Sultan's greatest liability. The rain in Istanbul during the spring of 1622 felt like an omen. Inside the Topkapi Palace, a boy king sat on a throne that was beginning to burn. Sultan Osman II, known to history as young Osman, was only 17, but he possessed the sharp, dangerous eyes of his ancestors. He looked out at his empire and saw a decaying corpse being picked clean by the very men supposed to protect it. The Ottoman Janissaries had become a bloated, arrogant shadow of their former selves. They were shopkeepers who drew soldiers' pay, and they were more interested in the price of coffee than the weight of a sword. Osman decided to do the unthinkable. He planned to replace them. He began secretly raising a new army of ethnic Turks from Anatolia and Syria, men who were not part of the Janissary mafia. To cover his tracks, he announced a pilgrimage to Mecca. It was a perfect excuse to leave the capital and join his new loyalists. But in the nest of vipers that was the Ottoman court, our secrets had a way of bleeding out. A leak reached the barracks, and the response was instantaneous. The brass cauldrons hit the ground with a thunderous clang that shook the city. The mutiny was not a disorganized riot. It was a professional execution of a government. The Janissaries didn't just scream for blood. They marched with the terrifying precision they had once used against the Crusaders. They smashed through the palace gates, bypassing the outer guards who shared their grievances. They weren't looking for gold. They were looking for the Sultan. They found Osman hiding in the palace's inner sanctum. For the first time in history, the shadow of God on earth was touched by the hands of a slave. The humiliation that followed was designed to destroy the very concept of the Sultanate. The Janissaries dragged the teenage boy into the streets. They stripped him of his royal robes and forced him to wear a tattered, filthy shirt. They found a scabby, skeletal horse and hoisted him onto its back. As they paraded him through the mud-clogged streets of Istanbul, the very people he ruled were encouraged to pelt him with trash and insults. This was a calculated psychological murder before the physical one. They were showing the world that the Sultan was not divine. He was just a boy, and they were his masters. They marched him to the Yedikule fortress, the fortress of the Seven Towers. Inside a cold, lightless cell, the final act of the tragedy unfolded. A group of Janissary executioners, led by the man who would become the new Grand Vizier, cornered the boy. Osman fought like a cornered lion. Despite his youth, he had the strength of the House of Osman. He fought off several men with his bare hands, his screams echoing through the stone corridors, but the numbers were against him. They threw a bowstring around his neck, the traditional method of executing Ottoman royalty to avoid spilling sacred blood, and they pulled until the light left his eyes. This was the Auspicious Incident in reverse. It was a total inversion of the natural order. The Sultan's elite guards had committed the ultimate sin. They had murdered their father. The news sent a shockwave through the Islamic world. If the Janissaries could kill a sultan, then no one was safe. The empire had officially entered the age of the Janissaries, a dark century where the throne became a revolving door. If a sultan tried to modernize the army, he was killed. If he tried to tax the Janissaries' businesses, he was killed. The ghost of young Osman would haunt the palace for the next 200 years. Every sultan who followed him lived in a state of permanent paranoia. They built their private quarters like fortresses. They stopped appearing in public. They became prisoners in their own palaces, staring out at the barracks and wondering when the next sound of a falling cauldron would signal their end. The Janissaries had become a cancer, a part of the body that had decided to consume the host. They were no longer the defenders of the faith. They were the executioners of the empire's future. By the dawn of the 18th century, the city of Istanbul had become a hostage to its own protectors. The barracks, once a centre of austere military discipline, and now functioned as the headquarters of a sprawling criminal empire. If you walked through the bustling markets of the Grand Bazaar, you didn't look for the Sultan's law. You looked for the man wearing the spoon in his turban. These men were no longer soldiers who happened to trade. They were gangsters who happened to own uniforms. They had become a parasitic layer of society, a vampire state that drained the treasury while offering nothing but intimidation in return. The most blatant tool of this corruption was the SMA, the pay certificate. Originally, these were simple documents proving a soldier was on the active payroll. By the 1700s, they had been transformed into a form of currency, traded in coffee houses like stocks on a modern exchange. Wealthy merchants, butchers, and even street sweepers bought these certificates to claim a soldier's salary, and more importantly, to claim the legal immunity that came with being a Janissary. On paper, The Sultan commanded an army of hundreds of thousands. In reality, when the war drum sounded, only a fraction of those named on the scrolls actually showed up. The rest were civilians who had never fired a musket in their lives, holding onto their certificates solely to bully their neighbours and avoid paying taxes. Nowhere was their predatory nature more visible than in the city's fire brigades. Istanbul was a city of wood, prone to devastating conflagrations. The Janissaries were the city's primary firefighters, but they turned the smell of smoke into a business model. When a fire broke out, the Janissary units would arrive with their water pumps and simply stand there. They would watch the flames lick the walls of a merchant's warehouse, arms crossed, waiting for the owner to arrive. The negotiation happened while the building burned. If the owner didn't pay the protection fee on the spot, the Janissaries would let the entire block turn to ash. Sometimes they were the ones who set the fires in the first place, ensuring a steady demand for their services. While they squeezed the life out of the capital, the world outside was changing. To the north, the Russian Empire under Peter the Great had dismantled its own rebellious guards, the Streltsy, and built a modern, Western-style army. To the west, the Austrians were perfecting the use of bayonets and mobile field artillery. The Janissaries watched these developments with a mixture of arrogance and fear. They viewed any attempt to modernise the Ottoman army as an attack on their religious traditions and their economic privileges. When a reformist Grand Vizier suggested that the soldiers should wear tighter, more practical trousers instead of their traditional flowing robes, the Janissaries didn't argue the merits of the fashion. They rioted. They claimed that the new ways were the work of infidels, using religion as a shield for their own obsolescence. The battlefield results were catastrophic. In the wars against Russia, the once fearsome Ottoman Janissaries often broke and fled at the first sight of a bayonet charge. They were no longer the disciplined machine that had breached Constantinople. They were a mob of armed shopkeepers who had too much to lose at home to die in a muddy trench. They were more dangerous to their own sultans than they were to the Tsar. Every time a sultan attempted to create a modern rival unit, the Nizam-e-Jadid or New Order, the Janissaries responded with the sound of the falling cauldron. They would march to the palace, demand the heads of the reformist ministers, and force the sultan to dismantle the new troops. The empire was trapped in a death loop. It needed a modern army to survive the European powers, but it couldn't build one because the Janissaries would destroy anyone who tried. The blood tax boys had become the jailers of the dynasty. They had reached a point where their existence was fundamentally incompatible with the survival of the state. They were a relic of a medieval world trying to hold back the tide of the industrial age with a wooden spoon. But as the 19th century approached, the House of Osman finally produced a ruler who had learned the most important lesson of Janissary history. You cannot negotiate with a fire, you can only extinguish it. The silence in the Topkapi Palace in June 1826 was different. For 18 years, Sultan Mahmud II had played a dangerous game of shadows. He had watched the Janissaries murder his predecessors. He had seen them strangle the life out of every reform. He had survived by pretending to be weak, by playing the part of a sultan who had accepted his status as a royal prisoner. But beneath the silk robes, Mahmud had spent nearly 2 decades building a trap. He didn't just want to reform the Ottoman Janissaries, he wanted to erase them from the face of the earth. The bait was set on June 12th. Mahmud announced the formation of a new, European-style military unit called the Eşkinci. They wore modern uniforms, used modern drills, and were trained by European officers. To the Janissaries, this was the ultimate insult, a direct challenge to their centuries of dominance. They did exactly what Mahmud expected them to do. On the night of June 14th, the sound of heavy brass hitting the ground echoed through the Etmeydana, the meat square. The cauldrons were overturned. The rebellion had begun. The Janissaries marched through the streets of Istanbul, confident in their routine. For centuries, this ritual had always ended the same way. The Sultan would panic, sacrifice his advisors, and pay the guards to go back to their barracks. They reached the palace gates screaming for the heads of the reformers, but this time the gates didn't open for negotiation. They stayed shut. Suddenly, a different sound replaced the shouting. It was the rhythmic, heavy thud of marching boots. Mahmud II had secretly moved his loyalist artillery units into position, encircling the Janissary headquarters. For the first time, The Sultan's slaves found themselves on the wrong side of the gunpowder revolution they had helped start. Mahmud appeared on the balcony, not with a white flag but with the Sanjak-i-Sharif, the sacred standard of the Prophet. He called upon all true believers and the people of Istanbul to rise against the vampires who had held the city hostage for generations. The people, tired of the fires, the protection rackets, and the constant threat of coup, responded. They flooded the streets not to join the Janissaries but to block their escape. Realizing the tide had turned, the Janissaries retreated to their barracks, slamming the massive wooden doors shut. They thought they were safe behind their walls. They were wrong. Mahmud II gave a single cold command: fire. The cannons, commanded by a man the Janissaries had once mocked, opened up at point-blank range. Grape shot and solid iron balls tore through the wooden barracks, turning the cradle of the elite into a slaughterhouse. The dry wood caught fire instantly. The screams of thousands of men were drowned out by the roar of the flames and the continuous thunder of the artillery. Mahmud did not allow any surrenders, and he ordered his troops to bayonet anyone who tried to crawl out of the inferno. The massacre lasted for hours until the heart of the Janissary core was nothing but a smoking pile of ash and charred bone. In the days that followed, the purge went global. The Sultan officially abolished the Ottoman Janissaries, banning even the mention of their name. Their symbols were chiselled off tombstones. Their distinctive white felt caps were piled into mountains and burned. The Bektashi order, the mystical soul of the core, was outlawed, and its dervishes were sent into exile. The Sultan's heralds travelled to every corner of the empire with a simple message: the Janissaries are no more. History calls this the Vakai Hayriye, the Auspicious Incident. It was the most violent and successful restructuring of a government in history. In a single afternoon, the military caste that had defined the Ottoman Empire for 450 years was vaporized. The tragedy of the Janissaries is the tragedy of absolute power. They began as stolen children, the ultimate victims of a cruel and brilliant system. They were designed to be the perfect servants, stripped of everything that makes a human being independent: family, property, and past. But the Ottomans learned a hard lesson. When you turn a human being into a cabled weapon, that weapon eventually develops a mind of its own. They rose from the dirt of Balkan villages to the heights of the imperial palace, only to fall because they refused to change with the world they had helped create. The secret rise had ended in a public execution. The Sultan finally had the modern army he wanted, but it was too late. The decades of Janissary stagnation had allowed the European powers to grow too strong, and the sick man of Europe would never truly recover. As we look at the ruins of the Yedikul fortress, or the empty spaces where the barracks once stood, we are reminded that no elite is invincible. The same discipline that creates a superpower can, if left unchecked, become the very rot that brings it down. The Janissaries were the children of the Sultan, the brothers of the spoon, and the masters of the thunderstick. But in the end, they were just another chapter in the long, bloody history of those who forgot that the hand that feeds you can also be the hand that strikes you down. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden layers of history. This story of the Janissaries is a reminder that the past is often far more complex and far more brutal than the legends suggest. If you found this journey as fascinating as I did, please consider sharing this video with a fellow history buff. It's through your support that we can continue to unearth these forgotten stories. Don't forget to check out our next documentary on the screen, and as always, keep questioning the world around you. We'll see you in the next one.